Mid-1944. After months of hard fighting in the southern sector of the Eastern Front, in which the Germans have lost all of Ukraine, and one of their best marshals, Erich von Manstein, the Red Army prepares to attack the Army Group Center. This powerful offensive, known as Operation Bagration, was going to deal the final blow to the German armies in Russia, and after 3 years of war, it was going to take the front line to East Prussia itself. As we have just indicated, after the brutal fighting that took place during the first half of 1944, this was the situation on the Eastern Front. As we see on the map, the most characteristic is the large ledge located to the south of the Pripyat swamps and northern Romania. In total, this salient, which was embedded in the German lines, had a depth of 400 kilometers and a width of 600 kilometers. From this point on, the Germans estimated that their Soviet enemies had two options. First, they could attack from the salient in a northwesterly direction and reach the Baltic coast. With this, they would pocket the entire German Army Group Center and north, with catastrophic consequences for them. This is exactly what the Germans would have done if they found themselves in the situation of their enemy, and it was on this possible maneuver that they based their defensive strategy. On the other hand, another option that they considered feasible was for the Soviets to attack Romania and seize the vital Ploiesti oil fields. In addition, with this action, they would enter the Balkans, which was a territory that Tsarist Russia had so much claimed. However, this was never the idea of the Soviet High Command, as they knew that an operation in which they tried to reach the Baltic Sea directly would be full of risks, leaving both flanks in danger. Instead, they were going to launch a series of phased offensives against Army Group Center in the vicinity of Minsk, to later attack the sector that the Germans had planned between Kowal and Brest. In any case, the Soviets began a series of deception operations to make the Germans believe that they were going to do exactly what they had envisioned. In this way, the Germans began to fool themselves, and only saw what they wanted to see, sending most of their armored reserves to the position of Army Group Ukraine North, commanded by Walter Model. Thus, while during the day they diverted troops to the southwest, so that these movements would be seen by the Luftwaffe, during the night they brought them back. The main one that the Germans had was that they had to defend a very long front line of about 2,000 kilometers, with increasingly smaller units. Approximately, each infantry division was assigned a front width of almost 40 kilometers, turning the German defense into a real drain. Because of this weakness, it was vital for them to find out in advance what the Soviet breaking point was going to be, so that they could concentrate their panzer units there. Otherwise, the entire German defensive line would collapse with catastrophic consequences. Approximately, the Germans had barely 1 million men, while the Soviets far exceeded the figure of 2 million troops. With regard to tanks, while the Red Army had almost 6,000, the Germans were able to oppose about 1,500. And finally, and with respect to aviation, the Luftwaffe had about 1,200 aircraft, while its enemies had more than 5,000. The distribution was as follows. From north to south, the Germans had the 3rd Panzer Army, the 4th Army, the 9th and the 2nd Army. On the other hand, the Soviets had the 3rd Belarusian Front, the 2nd and 1st Belarusian Front, and finally, already in the center of the salient, the 1st Ukrainian Front. Although these are the general numbers that each army had, it should be noted that the operational initiative was held by the Soviets, and this allowed them to obtain a superiority of 10-1 or even more, at those points on the front where they attacked. The attack began on June 22 with a devastating artillery attack on the German defensive lines. Due to the lack of troops, the German defensive line had little depth, and once it was penetrated in any sector, the entire front would collapse. The first Soviet operation consisted of a pincer attack against the city of Vitebsk, which was surrounded by June 25, and some 20,000 German soldiers were captured in it. With respect to the few panzer units that tried to plug these gaps, it must be said that they were completely devastated by Soviet aviation, and finished off by the Soviet armored vanguards. A day after the start of the offensive in Vitebsk, another double attack began further south, against the cities of Mogilev and Bobruisk. This was led by Rokossovsky himself, who made his way at full speed through the German defenses in the direction of Minsk. The German response was to send part of the Ninth Army that was further north, but they could do little to nothing in the face of the overwhelming Soviet advance. After a week of fighting, the Germans had lost some 100,000 troops, and both their 4th and 9th Army were completely crushed. Because the Soviets had attacked both at Vitebsk and further south at Bobruisk, a large salient had formed on the front east of Minsk, in which more and more Germans were in danger of being completely surrounded. This being the situation, the next step for the Soviets was clear. Attack the rear of Minsk both from the north and from the south, and cut off as many Germans as possible. On the other hand, the orders that came from Hitler's headquarters in East Prussia did not help anything, since the only thing that was ordered was that they resist without giving up a meter of ground. Having lost Kiev 8 months earlier, Minsk was the only major capital left to the Germans in Soviet territory, and it was there that the salient's 100,000 German soldiers had to hold out. In an attempt to stop this Soviet advance, the Germans mobilized as many troops as they could and sent them to the central sector of Army Group Center, which was off Minsk. It was at this exact moment on June 28, when Marshal Ernst Busch, who had been limited to faithfully carrying out Hitler's orders, was replaced by Walter Model, who took charge of Army Group Center to try to save the situation. From this point on, the armored reserves of the North Ukraine Army Group were sent to this sector, to try to contain the Soviet avalanche and prevent the loss of Minsk. The first measure that Model took was for all the units that were east of Minsk to withdraw towards the capital and establish new defensive positions. Regarding the reinforcements that were arriving, it must be said that they were brutally attacked by the Soviet aviation that had control of the sky, and a large part of them got lost along the way. Basically, it was what was also happening in Normandy. In addition to this, we have to add all the attacks that the numerous Soviet partisans were carrying out in the German rear, which were mainly focused on the sabotage of the communication lines. A few days after Walter Model's arrival, the Soviets were able to close a double bag in Minsk, and by July 3 they had another 100,000 Germans in them. It should be noted that all the German soldiers who were being captured in this operation were the ones who, a little later, starred in the parade of prisoners in Moscow. On the other hand, some of these German soldiers were able to break out of the encirclement on their own and return to the German sector, but most ended up surrendering by July 8. As a curiosity, in the pocket that the Soviets made east of Minsk, they captured the German General Vinzenz Müller, who was in command of the German Fourth Army. This general had replaced Heinrich at the beginning of June, days before the Soviet offensive began. Had this not been the case, it was likely Heinrich who would have been captured, and he would not have been able to defend the German defenses in the Oder later. Going back to the situation at the front, we have to say that by mid-July, the Germans had lost about 25 divisions and about 300,000 men that they could never replace. Simply put, most of Army Group Center had been destroyed, and the worst was yet to come. Between July 16 and 18, 2 new offensives began that would end up giving the final blow to the Wehrmacht. The first was the one that started in the direction of Riga, to isolate the entire Army Group North, and the second the one that started further south in the direction of Warsaw. From here, at the beginning of August, the Germans carried out 2 counteroffensives with the few armored units they had left, and were able to establish a temporary corridor in Riga for the entire Army Group North to withdraw, and on the other hand, stop the Soviet advance to Warsaw. By early August, the casualty count for the last month and a half of fighting was as follows. The German army suffered some 400,000 dead, wounded and prisoners, while the Red Army lost almost 700,000 troops. As we can see, and despite the drama of the situation, the German army still managed to inflict heavy casualties on the Soviets, although this was done each time at a higher own cost. Do you want to analyze how these offensives continued both in Warsaw and further north in Courland? I leave both programs below in the description. Well, I hope you liked this first program that I have uploaded about this huge operation, and I let you know that soon we will have an author live who has recently published a book on this subject. Thank you all so much for being part of this community, especially the sponsors who make this possible. Subscribe and share this program if you liked it, and see you as always every Thursday and Sunday. See you soon.